On the morning of the 12th of March, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia controlled an empire spanning tens of millions of square kilometers and over 100 million people. 48 hours later, he had lost control of the entire country. He lost all of that in the time it takes to have a camping trip. That's gotta be some kind of record. In this video, I'll cover the eventful tale of the end of the Romanov dynasty, full of riots, revolution, and betrayal, ending with the abdication of a man who, hours earlier, believed he could control Russia for years to come, finally surrendering his throne as an angry mob mauled his political apparatus piece by piece. Let's get to it! In 1917, in the Russian capital city, the food situation was awful. World War I had raged on the continent for 3 years at this point, and it had gradually ruined the ability of the Russian people to consume food. So, on the 8th of March, protesters flocked to the streets of Petrograd to protest. But they weren't just demanding more food, they wanted regime change. When the protesters took to the streets that day, they yelled slogans such as, "Down with autocracy." In Russia, Tsarism had become so unpopular, the masses wanted it gone. Meanwhile, on the same day, a wage dispute occurred at the Putilov metalworks. The employees claimed that the managers were underpaying them, and in response to that, the workers were locked out of the building and told to back down or they would never be given work again. But being locked out meant the workers had nothing to do. And do you know what people do when they have nothing to do? They overthrow governments. Exactly right. And so, those 20,000 metalworkers with nothing to do joined the protests, bringing the number of protesters up to 90,000. On day 2 of the protests, the number of protesters increased to 197,000. The protesters wanted to reach the city centre, because that's where the aristocracy lived, and they wanted to protest right outside of the aristocracy's houses. They lined up at the banks of the Neva River and got ready to cross, but the police blocked the bridges over the river, so there was no way the people could get across. There was a slight flaw in the police's plan, however, and that was that the river had frozen over, and so the people could just walk across the ice. Once the police had failed to stop the people getting over the river, the Cossacks were called up to disperse the mobs. Just one problem. The Cossacks probably didn't care much about defending the Russian government. Whenever they were sent after the crowds, they did the minimal effort possible. In fact, one time a Cossack regiment straight up refused to attack a crowd of protesters, and the protesters cheered them for not attacking. And the Cossack regiment bowed to them for that. This was not going well for the government. The Tsar wasn't in the capital at the moment. He was in Belarus commanding the war, but he sent a telegram back to the city, ordering the authorities to use any means necessary to crush the dissent. And that meant the use of firearms, which, up until this point, had not been used against the demonstrators. But, on the night of the 10th of March, the Russian officers were informed that tomorrow they would be shooting at protesters. The next morning, Russian soldiers were ordered to fire at the crowds. One unit refused to shoot and mutinied. The mutiny was put down, and no other mutiny happened that day. There was firing on protesters in multiple locations. It seemed that the dynasty would survive this. On the morning of the 12th of March, Captain Lashkovich walked into the barracks of the training detachment of the Volhynsky Regiment. That morning, in those barracks, the entire course of history was going to be irrevocably altered forever. This detachment had killed more people than any other the day before, so he was going to order them to shoot more protesters. But when Lashkovich walked into the barracks, he was met with cries of, "We will not shoot! We will not shoot! We will not shoot!" Lashkovich wasn't giving up that easily. Remember the telegram the Tsar sent to the city, demanding the protests to be crushed? Well, Lashkovich took out a copy of the telegram and read it out to the barracks. The message was clear. Disobeying the order to attack protesters would mean disobeying an order from the Tsar himself, the highest authority in Russia. Were these soldiers really going to disobey an order from the Tsar himself? And the answer to that question, ladies and gentlemen, was yes. Captain Lashkovich would not walk out of those barracks alive. Either the soldiers killed him, or he shot himself. We don't know, but what we do know is that those troops of the Volhynsky Regiment stormed out of that building and woke up the soldiers of the Preobrazhensky and Litovsky regiments, who agreed to join their mutiny. Suddenly, there was a significant mutiny with a genuine chance of overthrowing the Tsar. They decided to go to the Vyborg district, an area so revolutionized that the police were too scared to leave the station. The only thing keeping them alive was the fact that they had guns and the workers didn't. But that was about to change. The mutinying soldiers showed up in Vyborg and told the striking workers the location of every single arsenal in the district. And with that, the workers were armed. They hunted down the last holdouts of police and killed them all. And this was a story going on all over the city. Mutiny report after mutiny report after mutiny report piled up on the desks of the Moscow authorities. They put together a force of 6 supposedly loyal companies, but that force disintegrated every time it was sent to fight the revolutionaries. By the end of the day, the rebels controlled the city. All prisoners were released from prison, and the court building was burned. Military high command in Russia dispatched an army under General Ivanov to retake the city, but until they arrived, the Tsar had lost control of Petrograd. With the old regime thrown out, so everybody worth their salt sent representatives to the government building of the Russian Empire, the Tauride Palace. Trade unions, cooperatives, and political parties all sent people there to try and get a stake in this new government. In the end, they set up an organization called the Petrograd Soviet. This would act as the city council of Petrograd, and in case you're wondering what their claim to power was, their claim was, because I said so. They decided to set up a food commission to regulate the supply of food to the city, and a workers' militia to replace the police force. Meanwhile, also in the Tauride Palace was the Duma. Now the Duma was a government of Russia that had no real power, but the Tsar let it exist anyway because it looked like he was giving up power. The revolutionaries hadn't bothered to attack the Duma during the revolution, and so it was just sitting there in the palace deciding what to do. There were many in the Duma who wanted to create a constitutional monarchy, and others who just wanted a republic without a monarch. The Tsar had sent them an order to dissolve, but there were many in the revolutionary populace who wanted to use the Duma as a building block to form a new government. So the Duma had to decide whose orders to follow, the Tsar's or the people's. In the end, they did both. They officially declared the Duma dissolved, left the room, and met back up in the same building but in a different room as a group of private citizens. The Duma quickly elected a temporary committee to run Russia for the time being. What was their claim to power? Their claim was, because I said so. Although it should be noted that the temporary committee had basically no authority anywhere in Russia except for a little bit of power in the capital. True power lay with the aforementioned Petrograd Soviet, which was much more popular. I just want to stress how fast all of this happened. Before dawn, there was no mutiny going on against the government, and most of the city was under their control. By the end of the day, the entire garrison had mutinied. The government had lost complete control of the city, and people were trying to ram together a new government. Up until this point, the Tsar had been in Belarus fighting the war against Germany, but at this point, he decided he should probably return to the vicinity of the capital to see what was going on. His plan was to go to Tsarskoye Selo, a few miles from the city, but he never made it. 100 miles away from the city, he found that the next few stations along were controlled by revolutionaries, so instead, he changed course. He went for Pskov, where the military high command was. There, they discussed the recapture of Petrograd, but it was going to be difficult. The last of the troops in Petrograd that were loyal to the Tsar had deserted that morning. In the city, policemen were queuing up to be arrested to save themselves from the revolutionary mobs. There was no question about it. The revolutionaries had complete control of the city. However, the Duma committee knew there was still a threat of military attack, so they put together a military commission to restore order in the garrison, and use the garrison to protect the city from loyalists. A week after the first protest started, the revolution spread out of Petrograd. That day, revolution began in the city of Moscow. The entire garrison defected to the side of the revolutionaries. The city fell much easier than Petrograd. It was almost like the government knew they had no chance of holding out, so they gave up, and the revolution spread across the whole country as well. There was very little death and blood. The Duma Committee and Petrograd Soviet just telegrammed everyone to say that the Tsar was no longer in control, and that became true. Few people cared enough to risk their life to defend the autocracy that had oppressed them for hundreds of years. And those who were knew that there was no point trying. The people wanted the Tsar gone, and so did the soldiers. So, the Tsar lost control of the country in a matter of days. And it became clear there was no chance the Tsar could retake the capital. Remember that army that was sent to take back the city? Well, it arrived just a few miles outside the city, and got no further. The loyalist soldiers started mingling with the revolutionary soldiers, and became influenced by them. They decided they didn't want to attack the city anymore. The Russian Tsar looked on in dismay, as his chances of retaking Petrograd withered away. Meanwhile in the city, the Petrograd Soviet, despite being far more popular than the Duma, decided to allow the Duma to form a provisional government to run the country. So they began negotiations with the Duma's temporary committee. In the end, the Duma agreed to the following conditions in exchange for the Petrograd Soviet consenting to the creation of a provisional government. The first condition was that there would be immediate preparations for a general election to elect a government of Russia. Then there would be a bunch of civil rights and freedoms and all that, like free speech and stuff. But there was one condition that piqued my interest. The provisional government would not be allowed to disarm or remove from the city any soldiers that took part in the revolution. This was significant because it would mean that the provisional government government would constantly be under threat. You see, it took those troops just a few hours to bring a 300-year dynasty to an end, and they could do it again even faster, and the provisional government would always be much less popular than the Soviet. So, if there was another revolution, then the provisional government was going first. But the Duma Committee had obtained permission from the Soviet to form a government, so they got ready to declare the new government. The Soviet also decided to greatly reform the military. A bunch of soldiers gathered in a room in the Tauride Palace and had a massive discussion about how to reform the army. They decided that the officers would no longer have control of the weapons. Instead, the soldiers would elect committees that would control the supply of arms. With the Tsar losing increasingly more power, many believed that the monarchy would be saved if the Tsar abdicated in favour of his son. They were convinced that everyone hated the Tsar, but not Tsarism itself. So Russian generals convinced the Tsar to abdicate in favour of his son, and he announced his plans to do exactly that. Then, a speech was given by a member of the Duma Committee in Petrograd, declaring the need for a constitutional monarchy. The speech was a disaster. Everyone hated the idea of keeping the monarchy around. The Tsar changed his plans, and instead abdicated for himself, but also his son as well. Nicholas had woken up that morning, expecting to rule Russia for the rest of his life. Later that night, he abdicated. It was the 9th day since the revolution began, and things were looking bleak for the royal family. With the Tsar abdicating for himself and his son, the only possible candidate to succeed him was his brother, Michael Romanov. Dozens of Duma members gathered in his apartment, half of them begging him to accept the throne and save the Tsars, half of them begging him to decline it. In the end, he declined the throne. The Romanov dynasty was over. Later that day, the provisional government took over the ruling of Russia. However, the provisional government had so little power, it was barely a government. The only reason it had any power was because it was backed by the Petrograd Soviet. On the 21st of March, the Romanov family were detained and sent to house arrest in the Urals. However, just because the Tsar was deposed, it didn't mean that the Russian Revolution was over. You see, in Switzerland, there was a man who'd worked his whole life for a Marxist revolution in Russia and the world. He was beginning to worry that he would not see revolution in his lifetime. He had no money to start a revolution, and no way to get back to Russia to do a revolution. But both problems would be solved when he was approached by the Germans, who wanted to send him back to Russia and give him a bunch of money. Russia was already losing the war against Germany. Now, the Germans were going to hit them with a weapon far more dangerous than any German army: Vladimir Lenin. 1 week after this video releases, there will be a Kahoot quiz live stream about the information in this video, so we'll see who is paying attention then. Remember, the information from